By the time Duke Edmund Ashcombe realized that the dawn bells were tolling for a murder rather than a marriage, the trap for Lucy Bell had already been sprung. London, 1832. The grand nave of St. Jude's Cathedral smelled of expensive incense and cold ambition. Edmund stood beneath the towering stone archway, his hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, while Lady Clarissa waited at the altar, her smile as polished and sharp as the diamonds at her throat. The morning light bled through the stained glass, casting blood-red shadows across the invitation list that sat like a death warrant on the mahogany lectern. Behind every closed door is a diary waiting to be read. Welcome to Heiress Diaries with Manuscript. We drop a new perspective on power regularly. Subscribe and ensure you're always the first to hear the unthinkable. The heavy, rhythmic tolling of the St. Jude's bells vibrated through the floorboards of the Ashcombe estate, a sound that should have heralded joy, but felt to Edmund like the slow tightening of a silk noose. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the grand dressing-room, his reflection a stranger in charcoal wool and starch. Outside the window, the rolling hills of the estate stretched toward the horizon, a sprawling testament to 4 centuries of Ashcombe blood and sacrifice. Every acre demanded its due, and today that payment was his life. The Whitmore alliance is not merely a preference, Edmund, it is a necessity. His mother's voice had echoed throughout the week, as sharp and cold as the family silver. The estate was a gilded cage, its foundations trembling under the weight of ancient debts and the sprawling costs of maintaining a legacy. Lady Clarissa Whitmore was the solution, a woman whose dowry was as vast as her social standing was impeccable. As if summoned by his thoughts, Clarissa appeared in the doorway, a vision of icy perfection. She was already partially veiled, the delicate lace framing a face of porcelain symmetry. She moved with a practiced grace that suggested she had been rehearsing this walk since birth. Her beauty was undeniable, yet it was the beauty of a winter morning, bright, blinding, and entirely devoid of warmth. "You look somber, Edmund," her voice a melodic chime that didn't quite reach her eyes. She stepped closer, her gloved hand resting briefly on his arm. It was a gesture of possession rather than affection. "The king's cousin is already in the pews. The world is watching. Do try to look as though this is the triumph we have worked so hard to achieve." Edmund looked at her, searching for a flicker of the girl he had known in their youth, but found only the foreground woman of the London season, a masterpiece of social engineering. Clarissa didn't want a husband, she wanted a ducal crown and the power that radiated from the Ashcombe name. "Is that all this is to you, Clarissa? A triumph of optics?" Edmund asked, his voice low. She adjusted a stray fold of his cravat with a terrifyingly steady hand. "It is the survival of our class. Emotions are for those who don't have legacies to uphold." She turned away then, her beaded train whispering against the marble floor like the hiss of a snake. Edmund was left in the silence of the room, the pressure of the Ashcombe history pressing against his chest. He felt the crushing weight of the perfect match, a union designed to save a house while burying the man within it. Somewhere in the lower quarters of the house, the servants were scurrying in a frantic dance of preparation, but Edmund's mind strayed to the one face he hadn't seen, the quiet, kind presence of Lucy Bell, whose absence today felt like a sudden, chilling draught in a room full of fire. The transition from the master's quarters to the bustling arteries of the Ashcombe estate felt like entering a different world, yet the air here was thick with a tension that surpassed even the coldness of the dressing-room. As Edmund descended the back staircase, the usual rhythmic hum of the household was absent, replaced by a frantic, jagged energy. Footmen moved with averted eyes, and the silver polishing station sat abandoned, a rag dropped carelessly on the floor. Edmund paused near the kitchens, his brow furrowed. It was the morning of the most significant wedding in a decade, yet the gears of his house seemed to be grinding against one another. He scanned the faces of the staff, looking for the one person whose presence always acted as a balm to his spirit. Lucy Bell was usually the silent anchor of these corridors, her movements precise and her expression one of quiet, resilient grace. "Where is she?" Edmund asked, his voice cutting through the hushed murmurs of two housemaids huddled near the pantry. The girls jumped, their faces draining of colour. One of them curtsied so low she nearly lost her balance. "Your Grace, we weren't told you'd be coming this way." "Lucy," Edmund clarified, his chest tightening with a sudden, inexplicable dread. "I haven't seen her since yesterday's rehearsal. Is she ill?" The maids exchanged a look of pure terror, a silent communication that spoke of a secret too heavy to hold. It was then that the whispers reached him, drifting like smoke from the servants' hole. "Shame on the house. They found it right beneath her mattress, they say. A thieving heart behind such a sweet face." Edmund pushed past the maids, his strides lengthening. He found the butler, Mr. Henderson, standing by the delivery entrance, his aged by a dozen years. His hands were shaking as he checked a ledger. "Henderson, explain the talk I'm hearing," his authoritative presence filling the narrow hallway. "They are calling Lucy Bell a thief. What is this nonsense?" Henderson looked up, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. "It is more than talk, Your Grace. A search was conducted at dawn. Lady Clarissa's missing sapphire pendant, the intended for the ceremony, was recovered from Lucy's personal trunk. The constables were summoned before the sun was fully up." The world seemed to tilt. Edmund pictured Lucy, the woman who had once spent 3 nights nursing a stable-hand's fever, the woman who looked at him with such crystalline honesty, chained in the back of a black carriage. "She would never," Edmund whispered, the words catching in his throat. "The law doesn't care for never, Your Grace," Henderson replied softly, glancing toward the grand clock. "With the value of that stone, the magistrate has already moved her to the city gaol. They say the circuit judge is in town, and for a theft from a ducal bride, the gallows are the only end they'll seek." The wedding bells began to chime again from the distance, but to Edmund they now sounded like the falling of a blade. Lucy was gone, and the woman he was meant to marry was the one who had levelled the charge. The heavy silence of the master's suite felt like a physical weight as Edmund retreated from the chaos of the servants' quarters. His mind was a storm of disbelief. Lucy Bell was many things, quiet, resilient, perhaps too selfless for her own good, but she was no thief. He moved toward the mahogany wardrobe to retrieve his ceremonial gloves, but his foot caught on the edge of a delicate lace vanity stool that had been moved from Clarissa's adjoining dressing room. As the stool tipped, a small silk-bound portfolio slid from its hidden pocket beneath the cushion, hitting the floor with a muffled thud. A single sheet of vellum escaped the binding, fluttering to rest atop Edmund's boots. He reached down, expecting a list of wedding guests or a florist's invoice. Instead, his eyes locked onto Clarissa's sharp, distinctive script. It was a letter addressed to her personal maid, dated 3 days prior. The words seemed to vibrate with a cold, jagged malice. "The sapphire must be found in the girl's trunk by dawn on the wedding day," the letter read. "Ensure the lock is forced and then relined so it appears tampered with by her own hand. The Duke's misplaced sentimentality for the help has become a nuisance. Once she is at the gallows, he will have no choice but to focus his devotion where it belongs, on his Duchess and the Ashcombe line. Edmund felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a searing white-hot rage that made his hands tremble. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a tragic mistake of the law. It was a calculated execution. Clarissa had seen the way Edmund looked at Lucy, the way his voice softened when he spoke to the maid, the way he trusted her more than any peer of the realm, and she had decided to murder the girl to secure her own influence. The sapphire wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was the weapon Clarissa had used to slit Lucy's throat from across the hallway. Every perfect detail of the woman he was about to marry now felt like a layer of filth. She was willing to let an innocent woman swing from a rope just to tidy up a loose thread in her social tapestry. A sharp knock at the door broke her trance. "Your Grace, the carriage is waiting. Lady Clarissa is already descending to the cathedral." Edmund looked at the letter, then at the ceremonial sword resting on the table. The pressure of the Ashcombe legacy was still there, but it was being eclipsed by a different kind of duty. He folded the vellum and tucked it deep into his waistcoat, right against his heart. The perfect match was dead. He didn't see a bride anymore. He saw a monster in white lace, and somewhere across the city the sun was rising on a scaffold meant for the only soul in this house worth saving. The interior of St. Jude's Cathedral was a cavern of cold stone and suffocating tradition, filled with the muffled coughs of the ton and the scent of lilies that smelled to Edmund like a funeral wreath. He stood at the altar, his posture a rigid mask of ducal duty, while the Archbishop's voice droned on, a rhythmic incantation of laws and lineages. Beside him, Clarissa was a masterpiece of composure. Her white veil cascaded over her shoulders like a waterfall of frost, and her hand, resting lightly on his, was steady, betraying not a hint of the blood she had metaphorically spilled that morning. The moment arrived with the finality of a closing tomb. The Archbishop turned his gaze toward Edmund, the heavy silence of the cathedral pressing in from all sides. "Edmund Arthur Ashcombe, wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife?" Edmund felt the folded vellum of the letter against his chest, a searing brand through his waistcoat. He looked at Clarissa. For a fleeting second, he saw the perfect woman as the world saw her, the pinnacle of grace and aristocratic perfection. But then his gaze drifted past her, toward the grand stone archway of the entrance, where the morning sun cut a path through the gloom. He thought of Lucy in the damp dark of the city gale, the minutes of her life ticking away, while he stood here playing a part in a hollow play. He did not speak. The silence stretched, transitioning from a respectful pause to a jagged, uncomfortable void. Clarissa's head turned slightly. For the first time, her porcelain mask cracked. She looked back over her shoulder toward the congregation, then back at Edmund, her eyes flashing with a startled, emotionally conflicted expression. The uncertainty in her gaze was not born of love, but of a sudden, sharp fear for her social standing. Her fingers tightened on his arm, a silent command to proceed, to ignore the ghost of the maid between them, and to say the words that would seal their bargain. The Archbishop cleared his throat, his brow furrowing. "Your Grace," Edmund looked Clarissa full in the face, seeing the cold calculation in her expressive eyes, the way she mirrored the startled conflict of a woman who realized she was losing the narrative. The tension between his stillness and the urgency screaming in his blood reached a breaking point. He realized then that to speak the vow was to become her accomplice. The bells were waiting to celebrate a union, but Edmund knew he could only save his soul by leaving his bride at the altar of silence. The silence following Edmund's refusal was not empty. It was a living thing, heavy with the collective gasp of the British aristocracy. He turned his back on the altar, the motion so swift and definitive that the Archbishop stumbled back against the stone.
Clarissa stood frozen, her face a mask of fractured porcelain. Her expressive eyes, once filled with calculated victory, now mirrored the startled conflict of a woman watching her social empire vanish in a single heartbeat. "Edmund!" His mother's voice hissed from the front pew, a sharp whip of a sound, but he did not falter. He strode down the long, shadowed nave of St. Jude's, his boots ringing against the ancient flagstones like hammer strikes. Behind him, the murmurs escalated into a cacophony of scandal. He could feel the weight of 4 centuries of Ashcombe ancestors staring down from their marble tombs, judging him for this betrayal of blood and title. Yet as he reached the grand stone archway of the entrance, the oppressive scent of lilies and incense was replaced by the sharp, cold clarity of the morning air. His master of the horse was waiting in the courtyard, his face a pale moon of confusion as he held the reins of the Duke's white stallion. The horse sensed the urgency, lifting one foreleg and tossing its head, its polished tack jingling in the sudden quiet of the cathedral square. "Your Grace, the ceremony—" "The ceremony is over," Edmund snapped, his voice carrying the authoritative presence of a man who had finally found his purpose. He did not wait for a mounting block. He swung himself into the saddle with a grace that spoke of desperation rather than decorum. The formal historical attire, the dark tailored coat and fitted trousers, strained against the sudden violent movement. From the cathedral doors Clarissa appeared, her white wedding gown a jarring stain against the dark stone. She looked out at him, her veil catching the light, caught in that cinematic moment of confrontation between the life he was expected to lead and the one he was about to save. "Where are you going?" she cried out, her composure finally stripped from her voice. Edmund looked back over his shoulder, his expression calm and focused in a way it had never been during their courtship. "To do the one thing this marriage would have forbidden, Clarissa. I am going to be a just man." With a sharp command, he spurred the white horse forward. The stallion leapt into a gallop, its hooves smarking against the cobblestones as they tore away from the cathedral. Behind them, the bells began to ring again, not in celebration, but in a frantic, clanging alarm that signaled the greatest scandal the Tun had ever known. Edmund did not look back. He rode for the city jail, a man of title turned fugitive, racing the sun to keep a noose from closing around the only heart that still beat for him. The cobblestones of London's arterial streets blurred into a grey streak as the white stallion thundered westward, its hooves striking sparks that danced like dying stars against the damp pavement. Edmund leaned low over the horse's neck, his formal coat snapping in the wind like a tattered flag. The refined world of the cathedral had vanished, replaced by the grit and roar of the city awaking to a day of spectacle. To the masses, this was a morning of entertainment, a hanging to follow a wedding, but to Edmund it was a descent into the inferno. He swung the horse around a heavy merchant's dray, the stallion's polished tack jingling with every frantic stride. People scrambled from his path, their faces pale smudges of confusion at the sight of a duke in his wedding finery, riding like a highwayman. His lungs burned with the cold morning air, but the fire in his chest was hotter, stoked by the weight of the letter tucked against his ribs. As he neared the heavy iron gates leading toward the city square, a line of the King's Guard lowered their pikes, their horses shifting to block the thoroughfare. The sergeant in charge stepped forward, his hand raised in a sharp command. "Hold! The square is closed to all traffic by order of the magistrate. An execution is in progress." Edmund didn't slow. He dug his heels into the stallion's flanks, the white horse mid-step as it surged forward with a sense of urgency that defied the soldier's authority. "I am Ashcombe," Edmund thundered, raw and commanding, cutting through the din of the gathering crowd. "Step aside or be trampled by the very crown you serve." The sergeant's eyes widened, recognizing the mad man in the dark tailored coat. "Your Grace, the wedding, you should be at St. Jude's. The wedding is a farce and the law is being mocked," Edmund roared, his horse dancing with controlled aristocratic fury as he forced his way through the gap in their line. "If that woman hangs, you are all accomplices to murder." Skepticism flickered on the guards' faces. They knew the Duke as a man of cold, composed tradition, not a mad man on a white horse, but the sheer intensity of his focus, the calm authority in his eyes, despite the chaos of his motion, forced their hands. The sergeant hesitated, then signalled his men to break the line. Edmund didn't stay to thank them. He pushed the stallion into a final, lung-bursting gallop. Ahead, the silhouette of the gallows rose like a jagged tooth against the pale sky, and the roar of the mob grew deafening. He could see the black-clad figure of the executioner and a small, slumped form in white linen. The shadow of the noose was lengthening, and the clock in the square began to strike the hour. Edmund gripped the reins, his heart a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the impending end. He was almost there, but the lever was already gripped by a hand of cold iron. The platform was a raw, splintered island of wood in a sea of jeering faces. Lucy Bell stood at its centre, her small frame swallowed by a shapeless shift of coarse linen that looked like a shroud against her pale skin. Her hands were bound behind her, and the morning wind, indifferent to her terror, whipped strands of dark hair across her face. Above her, the heavy hempen rope swayed with a rhythmic, sickening creak, casting a long, jagged shadow that seemed to point directly at her heart. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at the executioner, whose black hood turned him into a faceless herald of the end. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the distant grey spires of the city, trying to remember the scent of the Ashcombe Gardens in June rather than the cold iron of the cage she had inhabited since dawn. She had accepted that her life was a small thing, easily crushed by the machinations of a world that valued a sapphire more than a soul. Then the roar of the mob shifted, the mocking laughter turned into a confused, undulating murmur that swept through the square like a wave. Through the haze of her despair, Lucy heard it, the frantic, rhythmic strike of hooves on stone. A white horse burst into the clearing at the foot of the gallows, its coat lathered in foam, its breath coming in ragged plumes. Atop it sat a man who looked as though he had ridden straight out of a fever dream. His dark, tailored coat was stained with the road, his cravat torn away, his face etched with a desperate, authoritative intensity. Edmund. As the horse skidded to a halt, the Duke looked up. In that moment, the noise of the square, the shouts of the guards, the cries of the spectators, the wind in the rope, simply ceased to exist. Lucy looked down from the height of the scaffold, and her eyes met his. It was a cinematic collision of two worlds. In his gaze, she saw a reflection of the girl she truly was, not a thief, not a servant, but a woman who was seen and valued. She saw the composed, authoritative presence she had always admired, now fractured by a raw, human terror that was entirely for her. Her expressive eyes, wide and shimmering with unshed tears, searched his, finding there a promise that the altar of silence had been abandoned. Edmund's posture was controlled, his hand reaching into his waistcoat for the letter that would be her salvation, but his eyes never left hers. He was a man standing between stillness and motion, between the law and justice. Lucy let out a shuddering breath, the first real breath she had taken in days. The noose was still there, a dark circle of fate, but for the first time since the sapphire was planted in her trunk, she did not feel alone. The Duke had come for his maid, and the world would have to move aside.
The executioner's hand tightened on the lever, the wood groaning under the tension, but the sound was eclipsed by a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the square. Edmund leapt from his stallion before the animal had even come to a full halt, his wedding boots skidding on the grit. He did not run toward the platform, he ran toward the magistrate's elevated dais, his presence so commanding that the line of guards parted like a retreating tide. "Stop this madness!" Edmund's voice was a clarion call that froze the executioner in place. The magistrate, a narrow-faced man named Holloway, rose with a stunned indignation. "Your Grace, this is a court of law, not a ballroom. The girl has been sentenced for the theft of the Ashcombe jewels. You are interrupting the King's justice." "I am preventing the King's murder," Edmund countered, his chest heaving. He reached into his waistcoat and withdrew the silk-bound portfolio and the folded vellum letter. With a snap of his wrist, he slapped the documents onto the magistrate's desk, followed by the heavy, gold-set Ashcombe signet ring, the Duke's seal. "Read it. Read the hand of the woman I was to marry, detailing exactly how she planted that sapphire to remove a girl she considered a nuisance." Holloway hesitated, his eyes darting from the Duke's fierce expression to the letter. As he read Clarissa's sharp, cold script, the colour drained from his jaundiced cheeks. The silence in the square grew heavy, the mob sensing the shift from bloodlust to a different kind of drama. This implies a conspiracy of the highest order," Holloway stammered, his eyes falling on the Duke's seal, which carried the legal weight of a royal decree in this jurisdiction. "It proves a crime, Holloway, one committed by Lady Clarissa Whitmore, not Lucy Bell," Edmund said, his chest heaving. He leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "As Duke of Ashcombe, I am reclaiming my property, the sapphire, and I am taking this woman into my custody. If you proceed with this execution, I will see you in the Tower for the wrongful death of an innocent subject." The magistrate looked at the gallows, then back at the evidence of malice. With a trembling hand he signalled to the executioner, "Stand down, the sentence is stayed by order of the Duke."
A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Edmund didn't wait for the official paperwork. He strode to the gallows and climbed the wooden steps, his eyes fixed on Lucy. With his own ceremonial dagger, he sliced through the coarse ropes binding her wrists. As the restraints fell away, Lucy collapsed forward, her strength finally failing, but Edmund caught her. He pulled her against the dark wool of his wedding coat, his chin resting atop her head. "I have you," he whispered into her hair, his authoritative composure finally fracturing into raw relief. "The truth is out, Lucy. You are coming home." Behind them, the magistrate began the process of voiding the charges, but Edmund was already carrying her down the steps, leaving the shadow of the noose behind for a sun that finally felt warm. 3 months had passed since the bells of St. Jude's had rung for a scandal, and the Ashcombe estate had finally shed the stifling chill of its own history. The summer sun now poured through the tall windows of the morning room, illuminating a space that had once felt like a museum of dead traditions, but now breathed with a quiet, vibrant life. Outside, the hills were a lush, defiant green, no longer appearing as a gilded cage to Edmund, but as a sanctuary. Edmund stood by the mahogany desk where he had once contemplated his ruin. He was dressed simply, the stifling ceremonial coats of his former life replaced by comfortable linen. He watched the garden path where Lucy was walking. She wore a simple dress of soft blue, her hair caught in a loose, natural braid that caught the golden light. There was no shapeless shift, no noose, and no fear in her stride. She moved with the new sovereignty of a woman who was no longer a servant to a name, but the heart of a home. When she entered the room, the air seemed to settle into a contented stillness. She didn't curtsy. Instead, she met his gaze with the same expressive honesty that had once saved his soul. Edmund reached out, his hand finding hers, not in a gesture of possession, but in an equal, grounding touch. "The letters from London have arrived. Lady Clarissa has retreated to the continent, and the Tun has found a new scandal to devour. We are at last forgotten by the people who never truly knew us." Edmund smiled, pulling her closer. "Let them forget. I have spent my life being a duke for the world, Lucy. I would much rather be a man for you." The transition from a marriage of convenience to this authentic, deep-seated devotion had been the greatest transformation of his life. He had lost the approval of the high society vultures and the perfect alliance with the Whitmores, but in the quiet moments between them he realized he had gained a kingdom. The flaw that had once held him back, the belief that his title defined his worth, had withered away in the light of Lucy's courage. As they stood together, looking out over the sprawling acres of the Ashcombe legacy, Edmund knew that the estate was no longer a burden of debt and duty. It was a place where a new kind of justice was being written. He had left his wedding to save a maid from the gallows, but in truth it was Lucy who had rescued him. He had found a love that no crown could buy and no law could break, a love that had finally made him the sovereign of his own heart. The legends don't end here, but they are easily lost to time. Subscribe to become a keeper of these stories so you never miss a word of the lore we're building together.